Hello everybody and welcome to Pride Cymru's LGBT History Month. My name's Lisa Power. I'm one of the board members of Pride Cymru, and I'm going to start by talking to Tim Foskett, who was the organiser of the first Pride March. Tim is there. And this is Gethin Roberts, who is the template of Gethin in the film. And was one of the original people in Lesbians and Gays Support the Miners, and Sian James MP, who also features in the film as a rather feisty young miner's wife, and is now a rather feisty Member of Parliament. So we're very pleased to have you with us, and we also have Andrew from Stonewall Cymru, who is going to bring us up to date with current campaigns when we get around to discussing that. But I really wanted to start with the march, and I'm going to spring something on you slightly here, because the originator of this event was a guy called Francis Brown, who can't be with us today because he's on holiday, but he actually started by turning to me in the middle of an Iris festival event with a glass in his hand, and I had a glass in mine, and he said, I think it might be 30 years since the first march. And lo and behold, it is. And so he can't be with us, but he asked me to read something out. I joined Cardiff University back in 1984, and full of enthusiasm I went along to the Gay Sock meeting at the King's Cross. A measly 4 people turned up. My initial disappointment was soon tempered by the enthusiasm of Tim Foskett, a first year who'd come out that summer. Within a few months, our numbers had grown tenfold, largely due to Tim's enthusiasm and charisma. If you've seen the film Pride, then Tim was our Mark Ashton. He was one of those individuals who inspired, created action and made a difference. He changed lives, mine included. In that period, we established the lesbian and gay officer post at the Students' Union, and we involved a generation of Cardiff students of all sexualities and political affiliations in the fight for LGBT rights. Did we change the world? Maybe not, but hopefully in our own small way, the marches of 1985 made a difference on the road to equality for all. What happened? Why did you decide to have a march?
Well, I was thinking about this on the way down yesterday, like, why did we do this? And I think my mum has got something to do with it. My mum was a feminist when I was growing up, and CND activist, and you just organised marches all the time. You know, when things needed to change, you just organised a march. And so we just organised a march because it was time to have a gay pride march in Wales,
And it was actually the first one in Wales that we can find. There have been no others.
I believe so, yeah. We thought it was the first one at the time. Yeah. There's something quite important, I think, about the whole of Welsh thing, which is the NUS Wales element here, that National Union Students Wales was a very important part of this process, actually, because one of the lovely things about the University of Wales is that it's all connected. And so we spent a lot of time with activists in Bangor and Aberystwyth at different times over the times I was here. And there were loads of us. I mean, there were loads of LGBT activists in the 80s, and we had conferences in Bangor and so on. In fact, what was interesting was the cities that didn't have a gay scene had really big lesbian and gay societies, whereas the cities that had a gay scene had relatively small ones. So Cardiff was fairly small compared to up the north and over on the west.
And looking at the coverage, if people want to read the coverage at the time, it's over there. It's very clear that the police were very supportive, which was not necessarily the case elsewhere. It's certainly in London, where I was at the time, but the police here seem to have been very supportive of the march.
Yeah, there was a kind of civic we're doing the right thingness about it, rather than that they truly believed it, perhaps. But they definitely felt like they had to do a proper job and look after us, and they talked to us a lot and about threat and danger, and it was us that they were concerned about, which I was touched by and surprised by at the time too.
What did you expect, and what did you encounter on the march? And if somebody else wants to chip in, please do. But what did you find? How was it? How was the reaction?
Well, it's interesting. I was just talking to somebody else and what I remembered is slightly different from what I'm quoted as saying in the South Wales Echo over there. I remember the first 2 marches, 85 and 86, as a lot of laughter and people finding it humorous that we were walking down. What's the big road? Queen Street, yeah, Queen Street. And, quite goodwill. And it says there on the 85 march that that was the case, and there were little bits of aggression. Somebody swore at us and so on. But what I remember most starkly was in 1987, by then HIV and AIDS had really impacted. And it was shocking, the difference that year. I think 3 people said to me, you should be going to the gas ovens while we were walking down Queen Street, compared to the years before, which had been more humorous, more good-willed. But it was stark in 1987.
That's interesting. And what was the reaction from the rest of what we at that point would have called the gay community in Cardiff?
Oh, the marches got bigger and bigger each year, and there were loads of us by 87, as far as I remember. One of the nice things we did, and I think in 87, was somebody had the idea of doing placards of towns and villages in Wales that you had lived in or came from. And there were about 100 of these placards with different towns and village names on. So we really looked visible as a Welsh thing, not just a Cardiff thing. And somebody had lived in the village with a very, very long name. And they brought that written on a piece of wallpaper, and we unfurled it on the town hall steps, and it was I'm sure it was in the Western Mail the next day. So as a headline on the top of page 3, I think it was. So.
Well done.
And how many people did you have on the first march, do you think?
Well, I don't. It's so strange, the memory thing. There is a little video clip of it, which we will find. Francis has got a copy of it, which is 30 seconds long. It looks like about 50, 60 people, I would say.
I don't think it was that many.
Do you not?
No.
What do you think
More
it
like
was?
30.
Right.
Do you think your numbers swelled as you went down, or did people run away?
We swelled with pride. We literally swelled.
It was one thing I remember is
Yeah.
One thing I remember is seeing people that we knew on the scene standing at the sides, determined that they were not going to participate.
Yeah.
And no matter how much encouragement we gave, they were determined that some of them turned their backs because they didn't want to be associated. And that's what I remember. And I do remember some negative comments being made, but...
How much courage did it take people to be on that march, do you think?
Well, this has just reminded me of another little story that we did. I don't know which year it was, but we did... it wasn't the first year, maybe the second year. We were holding a benefit at the Tunnel Club afterwards, and we fly posted the whole of Cardiff with posters. I mean, this is another thing we used to do. We used to get up in the middle of the night and fly post, posters saying we're having a gay pride march in Cardiff. And at the bottom of the gate of this poster, we put benefit in the Tunnel Club, and we had drawn a map of where the Tunnel Club was. And this was all over Cardiff, and the Tunnel Club went berserk about this being made public because of the danger involved. Yeah. So I don't know if it was, people were frightened. People were really frightened, I guess. And we had to go around and take them all down the next night, in the middle of the night. Otherwise they were going to sue us, so...
Ian, you were saying to me earlier that you felt very nervous on that first march.
But, yes, because it was being completely visible walking through the streets of Cardiff. But as you mentioned about HIV and AIDS, prior to HIV and AIDS, it was fashionable to have gay friends, straight people were coming to the gay clubs, etc. And once HIV and AIDS started, we were dropped like hot potatoes. I understand the reason why the Tunnel was not very happy of you advertising where it exactly was, because it was still dangerous to be an out gay person in 1985. And it still continued to be dangerous for years after, even though for some people it still is.
The first march, where did it go from and where did it go to? I know it ended up at the Students' Union.
It ended up at the Kings, and I think it started on Queen Street.
Oh, right.
Yeah, I think so too, actually.
It wasn't a particularly long march, but we did walk down St Mary's Street.
Yeah, and it was all planned with the police, and they were all there,
Which was a more visible route than happened when the first Mardi Gras Pride March happened, when Pride Marches were reinstated, because that one had a real procession, didn't it? But it didn't go through the most visible parts of the city.
one of the things about the marches, I mean, to this day, it really is a question of where you can go that the police won't think is too disruptive. And there's always a compromise between what's visible and what's disruptive, and the maximum visibility for the minimum disruption. It's very interesting, and that's a negotiation that has to take place on a regular basis every year.
Right.
But did you have a relationship with the police before that, or did you just sort of ship up at the police station and go, "Hi, we're having a march"?
I don't think we did. I don't know why. I think we knew that we had to tell somebody civically, so we did that through the town hall, and the police were somehow connected to that, and that's how it all happened.
So it just all came about like that.
Yeah. Maybe also we were advised through the student union, because they would be used to doing a lot of political activity, and we were involved with the student union as well.
And so we've talked a bit about that first march. What was Gay Cardiff like in the mid-80s? What was going? There was the Tunnel Club, there was the
King's
Student
Cross.
Union Group,
Yeah.
the King's Cross.
And the Terminus.
Yeah.
The Terminus, it says it all, doesn't it? It was the first gay bar I ever went into, and I honestly did think I was going to lose my life there before I went in.
Upstairs room you went to?
Yeah, that was where we had the very first gay society meeting, was
Yeah.
in the upstairs room at the Terminus.
Because you have to... Downstairs in the Terminus was a biker's bar, and you had to go through the bikers to get to the little room upstairs. And the bikers were very, very supportive. If they saw anybody having any homophobia or whatever, they'd go and beat them up.
That's really interesting, because we actually had a very similar situation in Lancaster, where I was in the late 70s, early 80s, and the bikers would look after the gays because we were all outlaws together.
Yeah.
And it sounds like it was a similar situation here.
Yeah. It was a tiny little room with a serving hatch about so big.
Yeah.
So how much, I mean, given that you were here, you were doing that march, how much did you know of what was going on really just a few miles away in the valleys, the struggle around the miners' strike and all of that?
Well, I mean, I was involved in the Labour Club in all the way through my student days, so we were very involved, and we were fundraising and all kinds of things, but we weren't connected up with LGSM as far as I'm aware. I mean, I was aware of it in the orbit, but we hadn't made that connection ourselves.
It's really interesting that it was two different bits of activism going on, but it does seem that it was separated out.
And there's
Yeah.
something weird about it as well, which is that I grew up in the London borough of Bromley.
There you are. You
there
could have
were
been
two of
Bromley.
us doing it in South Wales. I don't know how that happened.
But a lot of that is because Swansea and Cardiff never mixed, did they? You know, we still got that today. I mean, I remember turning to my husband and saying on the morning of that dreadful accident, when the taxi driver was killed, and I actually didn't know where that colliery was. The miners who were arrested were working in Cullinan South, and I didn't know where that pit was. You know, we lived very, very narrow regional lives.
Well, yes, the valleys were...
The valley. We were divided. When my father-in-law was courting my mother-in-law, and it literally is, 2.5 miles across the mountain, he was told off in the village where she lived for coming over and stealing their women. Because he'd come 2.5 miles up the road, and they tried to run him off. And they all worked in the same industry and in the same collieries. So I'm not really surprised that people didn't know about what was going on in Onllwyn and the Dillais, because we did live very compartmentalised lives. And I think for us women, it was the strike that really opened that out, because suddenly we were going to places like Lady Windsor and Cynhydra and other collieries across South Wales and the Gwent Valleys, Newbridge, and having to find our ways there. But before that, there had been absolutely no reason for us to. And coming to Cardiff was something you came on International Day, because Swansea was the focus of our valleys. So I'm wondering if that was a little bit to do with that because it was going on in the Upper Swansea Valley, Neath Dillais. Well, that's over there, isn't it? So for us, certainly Cardiff was another world. And we were doing our collecting in places like London and Birmingham and Manchester. And I think the Cardiff, the miners over in this area, and Spull and places like that, they were collecting in different parts of the country, because they divided London up, hadn't they?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what was your first recollection of meeting Lesbians and Gays Support the Miners? Was it when they came down to you, or did you go up to...
No,
London?
you came down. And funnily enough, I found a letter from Mark Ashton today, beautiful card from Mark, saying thank you for looking after him when he came down. And I'd forgotten that he'd written to me. Because, of course, we didn't have email. We didn't have tweeting. We had no way but writing to each other. So we wrote regularly. Because telephoning was obviously, it was expensive. You had to queue up, there was one telephone box at the top of our street. We'd all been cut off. You didn't have a phone at home because that was a luxury.
With the phones anyway.
Yeah, and exactly.
And most of us were living in squats, so we didn't have phones either.
Exactly, And I remember being thrilled, Karen and I, when we stayed the night in a squat. That was when we discovered that we'd been squatting. We'd really it was squatting on a luxurious level because do you remember it was where Andy lived, and he had this big, massive house. And they had a railway line running at the bottom of the garden in a massive garden. You're saying, what? This is a squat? It was very different to... So I think those scenes in the film where they talk about us looking at the wall, we were a little bit like that because we lived in 2 up, 2 downs. And we lived, until the council had modernised our homes in the late 70s, early 80s, we did have outside loos. We had bathrooms, but the loos were outside and just by the back door. So we were, and I'm a firm believer, is you can't call yourself working class until you say that you were brought up in a house with an outside loo. Because that it's very much how we were raised. And so our lives were very, very different. So the first actual awareness of LGSM is done very well in the film, because it says that there's the telephone call, but of course it was a letter. And we've had some disagreement in the support group about this, but I was interested in your point, Tim, about laughter. Because when it was announced, when it was read out, in the support group that we'd received this letter from a group of supporters, it was like a titter, and then you thought, why are we laughing? Why is everybody laughing? Because these are people who have raised money for us. It doesn't matter who they are. They've been so generous. We can jolly well get off our bottoms and we can say thank you. And I remember the only negative thing that was said was, one of the lads said, after we'd insisted that we invite people down and that if we twinned, and we had this process that we went through, which was quite formal, that we would inspect you first of all, and find out whether we wanted to twin with any organisation, and if they upheld our values and were like, had our beliefs, that we would then agree to twin, and there was a formal twinning arrangement, all very socialist and all very, prescribed. So we knew we were going, and David and Ali and Tom came up to meet with you and things. So the next stage was inviting people to stay. And we'd had people from all over the world to stay. In our home, we'd had journalists from Sweden, Switzerland, Germany, Russian people coming to stay. And the Russian people were very, very interested for the Soviet Union because they were just fascinated by our local supermarket. Because they'd never been in a supermarket with so much stuff for sale. And they kept wanting, every time we passed the Golden Save, it's called the Golden Save, they would say, can we stop and go in? And we'd go, not again. But of course they were fascinated by just seeing, to us it was pretty poor, but it was interesting what each group took out of it. I remember when we decided that we would, immediately we said, right, okay, if we twin, we'll just carry on exactly like any other group and we'll invite people down to stay. And there was this lone voice that said, does that mean we'll have to watch men dancing together? And the women just went bananas because we said, what do you mean men dance? You've been watching women dance together for years because that's what you did in the clubs in our valleys. All the men stood at the bar and all the women danced. But the men never danced with the women. Maybe the last dance of the night. Wasn't it? Do you remember the Kutch? Remember the last slow dance and then you'd clicked? Remember? You'd clicked and then you went home. Or they took you home or something. So it was all very, very traditional. And immediately the women, because by this point we were organising the picketing, we were organising the visiting, and Margaret was organising. Margaret Donovan was one of the characters in the film. She was organising who would stay where. And I remember Margaret coming that afternoon saying, right, you're going to have 2 gays or 2 lesbians. We don't know what we're going to get. You might get 2 gays, 2 lesbians, or a lesbian and a gay. That's fine, Margaret, that's fine, you know, we're ready. And then as she went through the door, she said, and don't forget the vegetarian option. And we said, vegetarian? What do you mean vegetarian? And we were really fazed by the vegetarian option.
So that bit of the film was true?
Yes, all the jokes are true. I think, you know, they weren't particularly said in those particular contexts, but Stephen was
And
very
if I remember
good.
correctly, your vegetarian option was a corned beef paella.
Well, that was, I blame Martin for that entirely, because he's the cook. I can't cook for Toffee. Don't believe the bit about the soup in the film. Complete fabrication, you know, because I can't cook. I cannot cook. And, you know, we were really worried because, A, vegetarianism was a fatty thing, you know, we didn't know anybody who was a vegetarian. 2, we were on a very limited income and we were reliant on the food parcels. So there weren't a lot of vegetarian options in there. And 3, it was expensive. You didn't have Stella McCartney, you know, sausages in the freezer section. You had to go to... and the oldest of us here will remember health food shops. Remember, you had to go to the health food shop and they sold very snazzy vegetarian things. And I remember the first time I had corn in Derek's house, and the children was just sitting there going, yeah, we're not eating this. And there was a little tantrum because he'd cooked the corn and he was going, I cooked that specially for you. So the children were there sat there going, yeah, but they ate it. But, you know, so there were these clash of cultures and clash of experiences. But I think the really important thing that the film captures and gets over is that sense of not just comradeship, but that we were all in this together. You know, because very, very quickly the links we made were that, you know, we had experienced the full weight of the state against us. We'd suddenly become the enemy within, and we'd been put outside of everything that we knew and trusted and held valued in our communities. Suddenly, well, no, you know, we don't want you having these rights. And the only thing we were guilty of was saying, no, we don't agree, we're not going to accept this. And it wasn't about money and it wasn't about power, and it was about keeping the collieries open and jobs for the future and our communities alive. And why couldn't anybody understand that? So when groups of people from other parts of the country and other parts of Europe and wider wanted to, you know, empathise with us and wanted to stand alongside us, well, they were comrades. There was an immediate bond, and I think we just took that with LGSM in our stride. I'm not saying that you wouldn't have. I'm going to give you an example from the film. There's a scene in the film where the Imelda Staunton character, Vina, marches up to the young miners who are sitting there and saying, get out there and grab a gay and dance. Yeah? Well, I firmly believe that story is based on my story. And because what happened was, if you came to our support group, you came on the Friday evening, people travelled down on a Friday evening, they would be dispersed, they would be allocated to the places they were staying. So by nature, if people left London about 5, 6 o'clock in the evening, it would be about 8, 9, 10 o'clock by the time they'd arrive, if they didn't get lost and go to the wrong valley. Yeah? And they would arrive and they'd settle in for the evening. And then the next morning, you'd show them a bit of the community, you might show them the colliery, you might show things that you thought were interesting in your community. And were you with Karen when she took a group of people to the butcher's?
No, I don't.
Well, one of the story Karen told was she took a couple of people who were staying with her to the butcher's to buy something for their tea on Saturday. And I think it was Bruce from Australia, and Bruce kept going, look at that. Karen's going, what? And on the top of the counter was a tray with a little flag in it, and the word faggots written on it. And Bruce was absolutely incensed. And in the end, the butcher went, "Look," he said, "it's a meat gristle." So there were all these little hiccups, and I remember teaching people to play bingo because they'd never played bingo before and things. So you then, on Saturday evening, there was the fundraiser up at the Onllwyn where everybody got together then, and we had some really raucous evenings and laughing and great laughter and great fun. And then on the Sunday morning, people would get up, have a lazy Sunday morning, maybe go and visit relatives with people, or go and visit some other interesting aspect, go for a walk up the mountain and see the lovely views. Yeah, Cardiff, and then, down then in the afternoon, on a Sunday afternoon, to the support group meeting, and then at the end of the meeting we'd wave people off. It would be about 4 or 5 o'clock, and then you'd go back to London. So it was a very... So the Saturday night fundraiser, in a sense, was an opportunity to be social, for people to get together and really have some downtime from all the stresses and the strains of the week, and meet new people and say thank you to people. So I'd gone up to my aunt who lived next door, but my grandmother's who lived next door but two to me. And I went up, and my stepbrother was sitting there. And I said to him, "Coming up the Onllwyn tonight?" "Well, I can't go up tonight," he said. And I said, "What do you mean you can't go up tonight?" "Why? You come up every Saturday night," I said. Oh, he said, "Can't go up there tonight." He said, "Those gays are going to be there." I said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, it's obvious, isn't it?" He said, They might fancy me." And I remember turning around in front of my grandma and saying, "Are you so irresistible?" And marching out of the house. And about 2 hours after we'd all been there, I could see the little door opening, his little face peeping round the edge of the door. And then in he snuck into the back of the hall then, he'd overcome his scruples by that point. But it was strange, because I think that wasn't his words, those were the words of other people, weren't they?
Wonder, Lisa, I'd like to talk a little bit about the effect that this had, and we hear a lot about the events, the immediacy of what happened and the communities that were directly involved. But my experience is as a 14-year-old lad in South Wales from an ex-mining family who were on their arses, which is a technical term for being very poor, and growing up gay, having realised comparatively recently I was gay, and seeing there were other people out there, but seeing that there were activists who shared both the mining heritage, the working class community outlook, and people who were coming together with them and willing to say, "I am gay," and good God, we'd never heard of the word bisexual then, and long may it continue that we can define our sexual orientation in many different ways now. But I genuinely believe the events of what happened not only served the communities directly involved, but were able to. They were life-saving events, and I know we've spoken about this privately, but that gays were on the streets of Cardiff, in my family, and I'll paraphrase because I'm afraid of quoting my dad directly on YouTube, but the day that it was the Pits and Perverts stuff that was in the paper, my dad came out in the morning and said, shall I say, "Flipping heck, jeepers crikey, even the blinking queers are supporting us now." Fill in the gaps yourself. But, for me, my dad was mentioning gay people for the first time, and it was a positive thing because they were willing, you guys were willing to stand out, be counted. Not be counted just as being gay, but being counted to stand on the side of the working man, as my dad would have said. And that in itself, when Francis said, "I don't know if we changed the world," yes, you did. You did change the world. You changed my world, and you changed the world for a whole generation here in Wales, and I firmly believe further afield.
So, Gethin, you were the Welsh person in LGSM. I don't know if you were the only one. You were certainly the most visible one. Was that instrumental in choosing to support a Welsh group, or what?
No, there were two Welsh people. There was Derek Hughes and myself who were active throughout the strike. And right at the start, there was also Hugh, I think, who I think he was the person who suggested the Neath licence Swansea Valley. And he then, I think, wasn't that active after that, but I think that was where the first contact came from. But I think what Sian was saying about the kind of the inspection of prospective twinners, and that they deliberately chose people who shared their values. I think that's really what made it work for us, was we arrived in Abercraf or Seven Sisters or Crynant or whatever, and we found communities which absolutely shared our values. And there was kind of so much common ground, because, you know, I mean, the film kind of makes out that this is a very remote, geographically remote and socially conservative community. In fact, the reality is that these were communities who had 100, 150 years history of socialist struggle and of internationalism. South Wales miners had been, you know, kind of involved in international movements for years, and had you know, I mean, now, I remember that we had corned beef paella the first time I stayed with Sian, because it led to a conversation about the Spanish influences on Abercraf, and the whole kind of thing of miners from Asturias being shipped in to break a strike and turning out to be syndicalists and joining the strike, and the kind of the Spanish influences, particularly in Abercraf, and the fact that during the Spanish Civil War, virtually every man over the age of 18 in Abercraf volunteered for the international brigades. You know, so for a kind of bunch of young leftists, this was absolutely kind of amazing that we were twinned with that kind of community, and that's precisely why it worked so well. I think that's why we kind of fell in love with each other, because I mean the film is really a kind of romantic comedy with romances between two communities, and I think that's correct, and I think that's why it worked.
So I think most of us has everybody here seen the film? Who hasn't seen the film?
I haven't seen it yet.
Haven't seen it yet. You've got a treat coming. The film is great, and it really, I've seldom found a film that captured the emotional quality so well. And it crams a lot of incidents in, and it's obviously fitted them in, and as you say, it's moved bits around. But is there anything that happened that isn't in the film that you would have liked to have seen in the film? Have you got a particular memory that you think would have been good in the film that got lost on the cutting room floor or never made it into the script?
For me, I think the thing that really should have been there is my speech to the Gay Men's Knitting Circle in the Milan Gay Centre, because it was one of the finest political speeches of the century. I don't really need this, do we?
When Tim came in, he remembered meeting me or seeing me on the stage at Gay Pride in 1985, and I was very, very proud of what happened in 1985, because the film captures quite a lot of it. You know, the fact that they didn't want politics on the march, that it was supposed to be a celebration, not a political statement. And we'd arrived, and things were happening all around us, and we were very excited. You know, excited kids running around. You know, people seeing each other for the first time for a long time, from other collieries and things. And at this point, I think Mike Jackson came up to me and said, right, we're gonna get you up on the stage. We're gonna rush the stage, and you're gonna have to speak. And I thought, I can't do that, because, you know, I haven't been invited. And my husband's a very quiet man, honestly. And I said, I can't do that. I can't do that. And he turned to me and he said, after what these people have done for you, you will do it, you know, he said. And I thought, well, yeah, that's true, you know, because their trust has been in you and they've supported us, and they're asking you to do this little thing now, and is it that difficult? But anyway, by the time Mike went up and negotiated, yeah, of course she can come up on the stage, of course she can speak on the stage. So when I got up there, and I think there were about 5,500 people there, weren't there?
It was Jubilee Gardens.
Yes,
yeah.
and it was really, really big. And I remember thinking to myself, well, that's it now then. You've talked yourself into a right, you know, you're going to dry, because it was massive, and I could see all these people. And then all of a sudden, the front row popped up. All of our friends, Gethin, Nigel, Jonathan, Mike, Derek, you know, Stephanie, Nicola, they'd all pushed their way forward to the barrier, to the front row, and popped up. I've got to speak to them. So I just spoke to them. I said the things that we needed to say, the thanks and the specialness. And at the end of it all, I mean, it was fabulous. It was very well received. And Tom Robinson led me off the stage. And Tom Robinson said to me, "Do you know what?" he said, "I think I've missed something really special." And I said, "You know what?" I said, "You have." And he said, "But they absolutely love you." And I said, "But don't you get it?" I said, "We love them." And I think, to people who hadn't been involved, it came back to that romance. It had transgressed political allies. It had gone beyond political allies. It had gone beyond being with like-minded people. Friendships had been created. Comradeships had been... one of my saddest... There was a whole period from about 1987 through to the early 90s where we seemed to be constantly going to funerals and constantly hearing about people that we knew or might have met who had passed away. And it got so bad in our house that my daughter actually said, "Please, Mum, we never go into hospital." And I said, "Don't be silly, darling." And she said, "But everybody we know goes into hospital and dies." Because we were hearing this news, and it's very, very sad. But I don't think we would have felt that grief so strongly if we hadn't had that special relationship. It had transcended, in a sense, just the comradeship, and it had developed into something much deeper, which was why when the film, when we were approached by Matthew Warchus and Stephen Beresford, I was more than happy to get involved, because I wanted that specialness to be told or to be registered and recorded somewhere for posterity, because we knew it was special, but what we didn't realise was how other people would think it was special, and we've been really touched by that.
And I think, I was present on that march as well that year. I remember the band coming in and just seeing that big band, and I'm sure there would have been some gay people in there, but a big band of what we saw as straight people coming in and marching. And I just remember that was the first time that it really brought it home to me that there were straight allies for the LGBT movement. And that wasn't there a lot of the time. And when it came just after that to Section 28 and the fight on that, we blew it because we didn't use our straight allies. We didn't work across in the way that we should, and we've retreated almost into a ghetto in the way that we fought that, and it didn't work. And strangely enough, that's, for me, where some of my willingness to get involved with the founding of Stonewall came from, which, although it was profoundly more reformist than anything I'd ever done, was actually something we really needed to do, and something that would call that bridge through to all of the straight community who were willing to support us, who we hadn't done enough with. And I think it's really interesting that the first example of that kind of bridge was actually a profoundly socialist enterprise, and it then we didn't learn the lesson fast enough, but we learnt it eventually.
Certainly my initial involvement in campaigning and politics came about 4 or 5 years after the events we've been talking about. And we talked about liberation campaigns, and we talked about liberation and actually being different, as opposed to the equality, the legal equality and the social equality that we now tend to talk about more. And I think that's a fascinating discussion, probably for another time. But the journey then with Section 28 coming in just a few years afterwards, the kind of the greater visibility which led to a more emboldened opposition to our rights, actually, which then led to even worse state-sanctioned inequality. We rarely use that term, and I vowed to use it a lot more, because that's exactly what happened in the late 80s and early 90s. These were new laws which were ushered in by backbenchers in the dead of night and supported by a government that were desperate to secure votes from people who would be more readily opposed to our communities than supportive of them. And what the legacy of that then is the reluctance of straight allies to stand up for us. Even in Neil Kinnock's speech on the reduction of the age of consent years later, you can read it in Hansard, and I know where he comes from on this issue, but he's talking in Parliament about being lucky that neither of his children turned out gay. And that was the language even of our straight allies back then. So that battle has been a long battle, and it's one that we still battle against today. The fact that even someone with my youth and the generation that have come after me, that we are still profoundly affected, as society is, in that only last year was marriage something that we were legally allowed to do, and I know that the whole liberation politics would say that in itself is a failure. But in law, we have been treated differently. In law, the government have treated us differently. There are still legal differences, and they lead to a cultural view which says somehow it's okay to debate whether gay people should marry, whether gay people should have families. Even the very fact that we debate that shows where we are culturally, and that is a huge battle. That is the battle for the next generation. I hope in 30 years' time there won't be an event to celebrate 60 years of this, because it will just be a footnote in history. I am an eternal optimist. I don't think you can go to work in any kind of campaigning or lobbying role unless you believe you can somehow change things. But so long as people will debate whether gay people, bi people, trans people should have legal rights, the very fact it's a debate is in itself an indicator of where we need to change. So in terms of our campaigns, we are working with schools. Here in Wales, we are working, just in the last 3 months, we've been working with 40 primary schools.
Oh, it's your fault then. Are you aware that there's a group called Christians in UKIP who've released a leaflet saying that the LGBT, that's our name now, the LGBT, which makes it sound like the mafia, that we are forcing children in primary schools to sing same-sex songs to indoctrinate them. It's all your fault, isn't it?
Well, I'd like to take the credit for getting UKIP's back up. Obviously, I'm politically neutral, but those elements of UKIP that are homophobic, or any other party, other homophobes do exist. I don't think it probably is me. The Daily Mail ran an article, Sex Lessons for 5-year-olds, on their front page recently, which was such a perversion of what Tristram Hunt and actually all the political parties are saying. I mean, the fact they haven't noticed that the whole thing would be different in Wales because they hadn't, 15 years on, caught up with devolution is a whole other ball game. But we're working with primary schools, and to the large part, people don't care. They haven't even noticed. We've sent DVDs into public libraries around Wales. We've sent DVDs into primary schools. I'm delighted because I've got a 5-year-old son, and I can assure you some of the songs he comes home singing, praising Jesus and asking for forgiveness for his sins. He's in a secular school. I object to far more in a child that hasn't had the chance to make up their own mind about faith or religion than I would objecting to him singing about his own family. And he doesn't have any songs about that I could repeat in public, that's for sure. We work with primary schools, but work with the schools rather than being the guest in the school. And this is very much our approach. So creating sustainable change, working with those that are delivering the services every day, working with workplaces, and that is something in Wales that the journey is about now working with employers as organisations, but actually as service providers as well. That's our next step. And working with the criminal justice agencies and the third sector to combat hate crime, to prevent hate crime, but also to support the victims of hate crime and of domestic abuse and violence, and recognising that that actually isn't something that is solely the preserve of heterosexual white men. In fact, it happens within same-sex male and same-sex female relationships. And, you know, so working with schools, with workplaces and with communities right across Wales, and working in both languages. This is something that has paid a huge dividend here in Wales. You know, we often will get letters every time we're on, the Welsh language media. Sometimes people in London actually, the diaspora, who will write to us and say, "Oh, I saw this on the internet. It's so fantastic to hear people like me being discussed in my language. I left Wales 30 years ago in one case because it was never a place I could be myself, and I've lost most of my language, and this is how I keep in touch, by watching, the equivalent of the One show in Welsh, and then suddenly up pops a gay, It's and of course the big campaign, which is the news in the last month, I'm thoroughly pleased about this, is that Stonewall will also be working to take on the big battles of the trans agenda, if there is a single agenda, but yeah.
Andrew, one of the things I've done a lot of, obviously in the wake of the film, is talk to different groups across Wales and the UK. And I've been a little bit taken aback by how younger lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender people take a lot of the rights they have now for granted. They have, when you talk about 30 years ago, for example, I was talking to a group of LGBT firemen yesterday in Newcastle, and they'd watched the film that had sparked Stephen Beresford's interest in the film, which is All Out Dancing in Delice, can be seen on YouTube. Yeah. Please watch it if you can. And they'd used it as an educational tool. And while I was speaking, I referred to going to London and going to clubs in London and seeing people wearing safety pins. And it was a cultural reference that had absolutely no resonance for them. They were all under 30, obviously, because they were really fit and hunky and super fit, all of them. And none of them had a cultural reference to wearing a safety pin and what that meant. And then when I've talked to younger gay people, 16, 17-year-olds, who of course have not had any problems with expressing. They have had problems, they all have their stories to tell, and I wouldn't, presume to say that life has been easy for every one of them. But for many of them, they've been able to exercise their right to have a partner. They haven't been concerned about being arrested, agents provocateurs. They haven't, the whole issue of having a partner of the same sex has been dealt with within their communities. And they don't have any idea. And some of the youth workers that I've spoken to said, thank you for using words like struggle, the fight, the determination to establish. And do you think sometimes that, I think that's what the film has reminded people about in Britain, if you're in this circle that we're talking about, if you're a socialist and you're an activist and you believe that you can affect change by action, that we need to remind people sometimes that they've got to get up and get involved.
And just in case, I saw a few puzzled faces out there. The safety pin was a sign for safer sex between gay men. And if you look at the exhibition at the back of the room after we've finished the discussion here, you'll see there's a number of badges there that have got safety pins on them, in that sort of a reference to that. And that was very much a 1980s code amongst gay men for safer sex. And I think it was actually London Lesbian and Gay Switchboard who started doing that, but it spread like wildfire. Actually, a guy called Hugh Robertson, who was also involved at times with LGSM. So if you've got what I'm going to do is come back to you once more, and then we're going to open it up
Yeah.
if there's any questions from the audience.
Okay. So on the complacency thing, I surprisingly get asked this a lot about today's young people. So yesterday I spent some time with some amazing young people, 14 to 18-year-olds at a school Plas Mawr here in Cardiff, Welsh medium school, which years ago people would have thought that they can't be doing anti-homophobia stuff. And they're teaching young people, it's been going for a few years. The project's called Digon. I can't praise it enough. It's peer-led, and they're actually involved in activism, wouldn't call it. On the point of whether they realise the struggles, the fight, the activism that has gone before, I, for one, am hugely, hugely grateful, and say it often, of the shoulders of the people on whose shoulders I stand today. But I'm also a 43-year-old man who's had time to think about that. My past 25 years from guiding NUS Wales through the battle, and it was a battle to include bisexuals in our campaign, let alone trans people, and some of the stuff, the vile stuff that was going on there, through AIDS activism, through then, and more recently, more subtle behind-the-scenes lobbying and campaigning. For 25 years, I've done that because I believed in the right thing, as I know you have, and I haven't done it for the thanks of the next generation. In fact, I, for one, am more pleased when someone who is 16, 17, 18 can come out the closet, they can be themselves, and they don't even have to think about the kind of homophobia, the prejudice, the queer bashing, the state-sanctioned inequality that we have fought for against for decades. I actually think it's a positive thing, ironically, when young people do not know the struggles that have made their lives more comfortable today, because that's what we struggled for.
As Andrew says, he's very glad when he sees 16-year-olds, teenagers who come out and don't have to think about any of the things we had to think about. I'm still profoundly grateful for teenagers who come out and do think about those things, who just come out and think, I've got to be active. And it's lovely to see that still happening, because I think in the 80s we were forced, if you wanted to survive, you had to become tough and become an activist if you were going to be out. And I think now you have a choice, and it's still great to see people making the range of choices. I'm going to ask Tim to say a few words now.
I've got so many things to say. I'll try and say them quickly. History. I was talking to the historian in the middle. What's your name?
Lorena.
About the fact that there's going to be some kind of permanent LGBT history element in a mainstream museum in Wales for the first time. Yeah. I think this is an important aspect of this issue of young people not knowing our history, and it's fantastic that we're having events like this and we have films like this where we get to learn about our history, where people get to to know that that's what happened. I was thinking about the Margaret Mead quote about "Never be surprised when a small group of people change the world. History shows nothing else ever has changed the world except small groups of people getting motivated." And I've been thinking about the small group of people who arranged this march, and we weren't all lesbians and gay men. There were straight women there. There were women who were involved young women who came from mining communities, and who lived with my friend who was in the women's group, and she put up a poster, and then she realised how terrifying it was to put up a poster, and all these little connections were made in this small group. And there's one other little story about culture clash that just always tickled me. This thing about beds is interesting, activism and beds. We had the NUS lesbian and gay thing was going to happen in Cardiff finally, and we had about 50 people coming, and we had to find beds for them. And so I lived in the University Hall up in wherever that is, Pennylan, and there were these two big rooms at the end of the corridors that were just empty. They were like a music room and an activity room, and nothing ever happened in them. And so I thought, well, we'll go and ask the warden of the hall if we can use them as crash pad accommodation. We just used to bring our sleeping bag and sleep anywhere in those days. And he was a very quiet man in his 50s, Welsh, known to be a Christian, nice man, but I didn't know how it was going to go down, the idea of LGBT activists sleeping in his hall. And he listened very carefully. We had quite a good conversation about what the conference was all about and why we were doing this. And then he said, "Okay, you can do that. There's one condition. The males must stay upstairs and the females must stay
I mean, I think one thing that is a bit lost in this is actually if you were a 19-year-old campaigning openly as a gay man in 1985, 1987, you were actually breaking, and not suggesting, Tim, that you had any sexual relations with other men back before you were 21, but it was a criminal offence. To hold hands with your boyfriend in public was a public order offence. So, you know, as I said earlier, I'm hugely grateful for the people on whose shoulders I stand. And I'm hugely inspired to hear all of you talk years later about your experiences and where life has brought you. And I'm even more inspired by the young men and women who are no longer illegals, that are able to come out. By no means is the world perfect, but you are the people that are now charged with that journey that we need to make in the next 30 years. That in 60 years, if we need an event like this, it's you that are going to be sat here justifying why we're having a 60th anniversary and how brilliant the world is then. So thank you.
Either of you want to have a word?
I think all of us kind of stand on the shoulders of a generation before us, and that's certainly true for those of us who are involved in LGSM. I'm really conscious that the film kind of shows us kind of plucking this idea out of thin air and Mark plucking a bucket from underneath his sink. Of course, it wasn't like that. There was a whole generation before us involved in GLF, in the gay workers' movement, in Gay Left, and those are people who had struggled to build connections with the trade union movement and with the Labour Party and other left parties for 15, 20 years before we had. So we all have that kind of debt of gratitude to generations immediately before us.
On Thursday night, I did something that I'd never done before. I went on an LGBT tour of Newcastle, and it was quite interesting. It started after dark, and we were led by two really inspirational people, Richard and Kate, who had researched the history of the LGBT community in Newcastle, and had this whizzygig little contraption where they could project images onto the sides of buildings. But it wasn't grand history. It wasn't the history of princes and kings and great people or celebrity. It was the history of the LGBT community in Newcastle. And what it reminded me of is that within all of our communities, there are LGBT people who are living their lives, who have been important parts of their communities, who have contributed great and small things, have truly been the backbone of their communities, but have been unrecognised or not understood or hidden by history. And I was inspired by everything. And one of the stories was the story of an artist in Newcastle who was very famous for his depictions of architecture. And then they'd realised, looking at these images, that every one of the most beautifully detail was so perfect of some of the areas of Newcastle that he'd chosen to depict were all gay cruising areas. And it had taken sort of 2 generations of people to realise, and that he hadn't been out openly, but he had done these beautiful, breathtaking images of his Newcastle. And it was his Newcastle. And it is our Cardiff, our Swansea, our Abercraf, our London. And that's what we should be reminding people of, is that LGBT history is just as much part of my history, my children's history, and other people in our community's history, and it's a really, really important part of it. And I can't wait until we've got an LGBT tour of Swansea, and I'm sure there must be one in Cardiff, but it was very, very interesting and reminded us that history isn't about the big issues or the big people or the famous people. It's about all those people who make the small changes, who create our communities. Diolch yn fawr.
I think that's absolutely right. And I'd like to thank all of our speakers today and the people who are here from the original march.